If you ask most people what dementia looks like, they'd probably say memory loss, maybe forgetting names, missing appointments, or repeating stories. But as a physician who's worked with hundreds of aging adults, I can tell you the truth is far more complex and far more dangerous. Dementia rarely begins with a forgotten birthday or a misplaced key. It begins quietly. It starts with the way someone walks, how they react to stress, the way they hesitate in conversation or stop answering the phone altogether. It hides inside emotional shifts, physical subtleties, and everyday moments that feel more frustrating than frightening. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because while the brain is quietly changing, most people are still convinced they're fine. I have treated patients whose earliest signs were written off as just a bad day, a little forgetfulness, or maybe some stress. What no one realized was that those symptoms were neurological red flags, indicators that brain cells were already dying, that inflammation was spreading, and that the delicate systems governing judgment, coordination, and language were beginning to falter. By the time memory loss appears, the disease is often years, if not decades, into its progression. That's what the research now confirms. The earliest signs of dementia may begin up to 20 years before diagnosis. 2 decades of slow, silent decline. 2 decades of opportunities to act, if only we knew what to look for. One of the most alarming patterns I've seen in early-stage patients is a subtle shift in how they make decisions. A person who once budgeted meticulously starts tipping excessively at restaurants or buying unnecessary subscriptions. Someone who used to be cautious and discerning begins trusting people too easily, even strangers. These moments are often dismissed as generosity or eccentricity, but inside the brain a different story is unfolding. The frontal lobes, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, planning, and impulse control, are among the first areas affected by neurodegeneration. When their function starts to slip, you don't forget names. You forget how to protect yourself, and that's far more dangerous. I remember a patient named Linda, 66 years old, who came to see me after her daughter noticed she had donated thousands of dollars to obscure online causes over the past few months. Linda insisted she was just feeling generous. But her medical imaging told another story. The early shrinkage in her frontal lobe regions was clear. She wasn't being kind, she was losing inhibition, and this was before she had ever failed a memory test. Her story is not rare. These are the kinds of signs that almost no one catches in time. And the reason is simple. They don't feel like memory problems. They feel like mood swings. They feel like social withdrawal. They feel like waking up in the morning and not feeling like yourself. But the brain is already waving its first white flags. Most people, 99% in fact, ignore them completely. By the time they or their family members take action, the disease has usually already done years of damage. Another deeply overlooked symptom is how people pull away from others, not because they don't care, but because it's suddenly harder to follow conversations, understand jokes, or find the right words. As a result, they withdraw. It starts slowly, a missed invitation here, a declined phone call there. Eventually, the weekly social outing turns into a solo afternoon at home. From the outside, it looks like introversion or fatigue. But I've seen the MRI scans of these patients. I've seen how the left temporal lobe, the region that governs language, word retrieval, and social interpretation, shrinks subtly in the earliest stages of dementia. It's not that they don't want to talk. It's that talking becomes hard, listening becomes work, responding becomes overwhelming, and instead of saying that, they go quiet. I once sat across from a man named George, who hadn't seen his best friend in over 6 months. When I asked why, he looked down and said, "I don't know what to say anymore." His memory wasn't failing, but his confidence was. His brain was still sharp in many ways, but he could no longer track stories the way he used to. He couldn't recall names quickly or follow fast-paced conversation. He said the silence felt safer. That is not aging. That's early neurological breakdown. Vision changes are another clue almost everyone misses. Not blurry vision, but distorted perception. Patients tell me they feel clumsier. They bump into tables they've walked past for years. They spill drinks, misjudge distances, feel slightly off when parking or stepping onto curbs. Most chalk it up to age or poor coordination, but what's really happening is that the occipital and parietal lobes, responsible for spatial awareness, are beginning to degrade. Your eyes are sending accurate signals, but your brain is misreading them. A patient of mine, Nora, started placing her coffee mug slightly off the table without realizing it. She blamed her eyesight. But her ophthalmologist found no problem. What we discovered instead was early dysfunction in her brain's visual spatial processing. That mug placement was a warning, and it was one we almost missed. One of the most heartbreaking things I've witnessed is the erosion of routine. A person who's made the same breakfast every day for 20 years suddenly starts forgetting ingredients. A man who always balanced his checkbook forgets which bills are due. These aren't senior moments. They're failures of the executive system, the brain's ability to sequence, organize, and complete multi-step tasks. When a person forgets how to do something they've done for decades, we must not brush it off. That's not age, that's impairment. These are the kinds of signs I urge families to watch for. Not just forgetting what day it is, but losing track of how to live the day, missing steps, confusing instructions, needing repeated reminders for simple routines. A woman I treated, Janet, could no longer figure out how to work her microwave, one she'd used for 15 years. Her son thought she was just tired, but cognitive testing showed us a different story. Her brain's ability to plan and execute had already begun to erode. And yet, even as all of these signs unfold, judgment lapses, social withdrawal, clumsiness, confusion, most patients remain undiagnosed. Why? Because none of it looks like what we're taught dementia looks like. But by the time memory loss appears, the brain may already have lost billions of neurons. And the earlier we act, the more of those we can protect. One of the most disturbing things I've had to explain to families is that language doesn't just disappear overnight. The decline begins subtly. It may show up as a hesitation mid-sentence, a strange pause where the word should be. A refrigerator becomes the cold thing. A dog becomes the animal. What people don't realize is that this isn't forgetfulness. It's an early-stage breakdown in the brain's word retrieval systems. The left temporal lobe, particularly the region involved in naming and word storage, is often one of the first to show structural change in dementia. We call it anomic aphasia, and when it begins, the affected person often knows exactly what they want to say. They just can't say it. That alone is terrifying. Imagine knowing what you mean but being locked out of the vocabulary to express it. It starts with simple substitutions. Thing instead of the actual object. Long silences as someone searches their mind and comes up empty. Most families overlook these moments. They think, we all forget words sometimes. And it's true, we do. But the difference with neurodegeneration is frequency, intensity, and emotional impact. When it becomes daily, when a person avoids conversation to escape embarrassment, when they begin trailing off mid-sentence and letting others finish for them, those are not normal signs of aging. That's neurological degradation. I had a patient, Carl, who was known for his stories. He could light up a room with conversation. Over the course of just a few months, his sentences shortened. His pauses grew longer. Eventually he stopped engaging. His wife said it was just depression. But scans told a different story. Early degeneration of his language centers. His silence wasn't emotional, it was anatomical. Language is deeply tied to our identity, so when it slips, it creates confusion, shame, and withdrawal. But one of the even more deceptive early signs of dementia is something many people associate with emotion, not cognition: anxiety. I've seen more than a dozen patients in the last year alone come to me with new anxiety that seemed to appear out of nowhere. These were not anxious people. They were confident, grounded, emotionally healthy adults who suddenly couldn't tolerate crowds, loud noises, or unpredictable environments. Grocery stores made them uncomfortable. They didn't want to drive. Some would pace. Others would become agitated over small changes in routine. This isn't psychological. This is neurochemical. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, regions of the brain responsible for fear response and emotional regulation, begin to disconnect in early dementia. That disconnect leads to heightened sensitivity, exaggerated stress reactions, and what patients describe as restlessness or feeling wired but tired. But because it looks like anxiety, it gets misdiagnosed. Antidepressants are prescribed, counseling is suggested, and meanwhile the brain continues to decline, undiagnosed, untreated, and misunderstood. One of my patients, Patricia, started feeling nervous going to her own church. She'd been attending every Sunday for 30 years, but now the sound of the choir made her hands shake. She couldn't explain it, neither could her family. But as I spoke to her, I noticed something else: repetition. The same questions asked minutes apart. The anxiety wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. Her brain had begun to lose control over how it processed stimuli. Another early indicator that flies under the radar is visual interpretation. Not your eyesight, your brain's ability to understand what your eyes are seeing. This is different from blurry vision or needing stronger glasses. This is when reading becomes frustrating, when newspapers feel confusing, when you look at a set of instructions or a diagram or even a street sign, and your brain can't seem to connect the dots. The image is there, but the meaning doesn't register. You reread the same line multiple times. You lose your place while reading. You find it harder to interpret graphs, maps, or even subtitles on TV. This isn't fatigue. This is the brain's posterior cortex beginning to lose efficiency. The angular gyrus, a part of the brain critical for language, reading comprehension, and visual decoding, begins to shrink, and the effect is subtle but deeply frustrating. One of my clients, Anita, a retired librarian, came in crying one day, not because she had forgotten someone's name, but because she couldn't finish the book she'd been reading. She said the words just felt harder. Her eyes were fine, but her brain couldn't keep up. She didn't have a memory complaint. She had a reading complaint. That was her first symptom, and it was far more predictive of dementia than we realized. Her case still haunts me, because if she hadn't spoken up, we might have missed the chance to intervene. Other signs show up in places you wouldn't expect, like hygiene. I once had a patient whose daughter brought her in after noticing her mother hadn't changed clothes for 3 days. This was a woman who used to take pride in her appearance. Hair always done, outfit always coordinated. But something had shifted. She said she just forgot to shower. She said she'd do it later. But later never came. This isn't about laziness. This isn't about depression. This is about the brain's executive function breaking down, the part of the brain that initiates action, organizes steps, and follows through on goals begins to lose power. What used to be automatic, brush teeth, pick an outfit, take a shower, now feels like climbing a mountain. The energy to start is gone. The ability to sequence the steps is scrambled. The worst part? These behaviors get brushed off. Family members assume it's mood. They assume it's grief, stubbornness, or stubborn aging. But 83% of early-stage dementia patients show signs of declining personal hygiene before memory even fails. And once it becomes consistent, wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row, forgetting to brush or ignoring grooming altogether, it's time to look deeper. Because once motivation and self-care go, executive function is following closely behind. The next sign is one we all notice but often dismiss: repeating yourself. You tell a story to someone, then 10 minutes later you tell it again. You ask the same question twice in one meal. You remind your spouse of an event you already mentioned this morning. And at first it's chalked up to distraction, but as it continues, something becomes painfully clear. The short-term memory system is breaking down. The hippocampus, the brain's memory filing system, is starting to fail. You remember old vacations vividly but forget today's phone call. You recall childhood friends but can't retain what your daughter just said. I've seen families walk a painful line with this. They want to be polite. They smile and say, "You already told me that." And the person nods, embarrassed. But the repetition doesn't stop. And that's the key difference between normal forgetfulness and early dementia: pattern. When the repetition becomes daily, consistent, and unintentional, when the person has no idea they've already said something, it's no longer benign. In fact, patients who begin repeating themselves regularly are up to 5 times more likely to receive a dementia diagnosis within 2 years. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most predictive behavioral symptoms we know of. and yet it gets ignored until it can't be ignored anymore. The most frightening sign, the one almost nobody associates with cognitive decline, is the one happening right in front of you every single day. The way someone walks, not limping, not dragging a foot, not pain-related, but a quiet shift in pace, rhythm, or balance. Maybe they start moving more slowly. Maybe they don't swing one arm the way they used to. Maybe their stride becomes shorter, more tentative. Maybe they stop turning their head while walking. Or you notice a new stiffness in the way they rise from a chair and begin to move. These are not just signs of arthritis or aging. These are neurological. Walking is a full brain activity. It requires coordination from the cerebellum, rhythm from the basal ganglia, planning from the frontal lobes, and initiation from deep subcortical circuits that regulate movement. When someone begins to walk differently, when their gait subtly changes before any memory loss, it's often because the brain is already losing connectivity in these vital areas. It's no longer about muscle strength or joint health. It's about disruption in motor planning, sequencing, and automatic control. And once that signal weakens, every step becomes harder to coordinate. The body hesitates, the stride shortens. The movement feels less natural, more mechanical. One patient, Walter, had been coming in for annual checkups for years. He was sharp, kind, and always steady on his feet. But then one year I noticed something different. He walked slower. He wasn't limping. He wasn't in pain, but his arms weren't swinging. His steps were cautious, almost like he was thinking about every movement. When I asked about it, he just shrugged and said, "Maybe I'm just getting older." But I knew better. We ordered a neuro workup. His scans revealed early white matter changes in the frontal lobes and subcortical motor networks. He didn't have memory loss yet, but his brain was already rewiring, and his feet were the first messengers. What's most disturbing is that these gait disturbances don't only predict cognitive decline, they also predict cardiovascular collapse. Studies have shown that seniors with subtle gait changes, shorter steps, reduced speed, altered cadence, had a significantly higher risk of developing heart failure. That's right, your brain and your heart may both be signaling trouble through your feet. A 2021 study found that people with early gait changes had a 57% higher chance of developing dementia and heart failure in the years that followed, even if they had no current symptoms of either. So while the world is watching for memory lapses, your legs may already be whispering the truth. The cruelest part about dementia is how invisible its early signs are until they're not. By the time someone starts forgetting where they are, by the time they can't recognize a face or recall a loved one's name, the damage is severe and often irreversible. But before that, there are warning signs, dozens of them. They are subtle, frustrating, and easy to rationalize. Mood swings, vision glitches, social withdrawal, repeating stories, struggling with daily tasks, a sudden spike in anxiety, a shift in the way someone carries themselves. Each of these is a clue, and when they start appearing together, they form a pattern, a message from the brain that something is changing beneath the surface. I've had to sit across from sons, daughters, and spouses who thought they had years left, who believed their loved one was just slowing down. I've seen the heartbreak when they realized those signs had been there for years and were dismissed as stress, tiredness, or normal aging. I've seen the guilt, the fear, the wish that someone had said something sooner, and I've seen the power of early awareness. What happens when a family recognizes the signals, acts quickly, and begins supporting the brain before the damage becomes permanent. That's what makes this knowledge so powerful, because if these signs appear 10 to 20 years before diagnosis, that means we're not helpless, we're not doomed, we're being given a window. And in that window, lifestyle changes. Movement, nutrition, cognitive stimulation, sleep, emotional support can slow or even stall progression, but only if we catch it early, only if we're paying attention. So if you notice something feels different about you, about someone you love, don't ignore it. If you see someone pulling away socially, walking differently, growing anxious, or losing the thread of conversations they used to follow easily, speak up. Don't assume it's stress. Don't tell yourself we all get forgetful. Ask questions, track changes, involve a doctor who listens, not just to memory, but to mood, movement, speech, and behavior. Because dementia doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up in repetition, in hesitation, in tiny deviations from who a person used to be. And for too long we've been trained to wait until the memory is gone before taking it seriously. That's backwards. That's why millions of people go undiagnosed until the disease is too far along to fight. The truth is, we can fight it earlier. We can spot it earlier. And we can help people live longer, more stable, more independent lives if we stop waiting for it to look like the dementia we've seen in movies or hospitals. I want to leave you with something simple but critical. Trust your instincts. If you feel off, if your mornings feel foggy, if you've started avoiding people or places, if you're repeating yourself more than usual or losing confidence in basic tasks, don't ignore it. If your parent or partner is walking differently, responding differently, dressing differently, and it's not like them, don't chalk it up to age. Ask why, because when we start asking why, we start finding answers. And when we find answers early, we give the brain a chance to protect itself. Your body is always talking to you. Sometimes it uses your memory. Sometimes it uses your voice. Sometimes it uses your feet. Listen, because the difference between decline and dignity could be one early sign you didn't overlook.